Whoever wishes to foresee the future must consult the past, for human events ever resemble those of preceding times. This is a quote from Machiavelli about the importance of understanding our history. Aotearoa New Zealand, like all nations, must grapple with its past if it intends to avoid repeating its mistakes. With the introduction of ACT Party's Treaty Principles Bill, the discussion around Te Tiriti has come to a head. On one side of the argument, the current interpretation of Te Tiriti has gone too far. On the other, not far enough. To understand this further, I wanted to learn more about New Zealand's history. How colonisation occurred, the context with which Te Tiriti and the treaty was signed, and the implication of what happened in the 1800s and how this affects people today. So in this episode, I bring you Professor Paul Moon, Officer of New Zealand Order of Merit. Paul is a historian and professor at Auckland University of Technology who has devoted his career to researching New Zealand history, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and British colonisation. He is an avid author and written many books on early New Zealand history and biographies of both British settlers and Māori rangatira. I also speak to Paul about the recently developed New Zealand history curriculum, as well as the state of our universities and academia. Are we creating environments for freedom of thought, exploration, and expression? Or has challenging the orthodoxy become a social faux pas? So, Paul, my brother became an engineer. I became a doctor, to my father's greatest disappointment. He was a lover of the humanities, and my brother John and I, we just wanted to get as many excellence credits as possible for our respective science-based career. And initially that was a good idea. I got into medical school, now I'm a doctor, but I think that actually that time that I spent doing the sciences, like that was fine, but I feel like it didn't really add much to who I am as a doctor. It didn't really add much even to my medical training, if I'm gonna be honest. But looking back, I actually kind of have some regrets that I didn't actually pursue the social sciences when I was at school. I think that looking back now in my 30s, I'm like, this is actually really important stuff. This is about understanding what happened in the past, what are we doing now, and how can we move forward as a people, and how can we understand patterns of behaviour of people in the past and how that's relevant to today. And so I thought, who better to get on this podcast than you, Paul, to talk about history, from a New Zealand context, and talk about what we've done in the past, where are we at today, and where are we going forward. So why is it important that we have some ideas on a consensus of history in terms of what happened, where are we now, and where are we going in the future?
Right. Well, history fulfills all sorts of functions. One of the most common questions I get asked is, why bother studying it because it's already happened? It seems redundant to a lot of people. And I think that's the wrong question because, as you pointed out, it does have functions. One of them is it's part of the architecture of our identity. And the more that you study history, both your own and in general, the more intricate and more robust that identity becomes. So it plays a key role in identity formation. From that, it plays a key role in meaning making. How do we make sense of what's happening around us? Well, without history, we actually can't. It's that vital. Another aspect of history is that it acts almost like an instruction manual. So if something goes wrong with your car, how do you fix it? And where do you start? Well, you go to advice, and where do you get the advice from? Someone who's done it already. And so history acts like a vast textbook that if you want to know how something's done, how you solve a problem, how do you get around this, how do you achieve this, there are ample examples. Now, they're not perfect because the situation's always different, but history has all these functions attached to it. Then it has the function of making sense out of evidence, and that's a critical part of the whole discipline. People say it's about understanding the past. That's not quite correct. I think history is about understanding the surviving fragments of the past because most of it's gone. We'll never recover all of it. So we have this inheritance, this random inheritance of information. How do we assemble that to make sense? And that's really at the heart of what history is.
Because how do we make sense of that history in the way that you're saying? Because I feel like people want to take it to their own interpretations, I suppose. You know, you think about it, there's about 7 billion people on this earth right now. And I don't even know if we could keep the whole entirety of the history of all 7 billion people right now. I mean, everyone's on social media, so in a way there's a documentation of life, but even then what people put out on social media is sort of a highlights reel, you could say, of what their life is. So how do we make sense of the past when, like you say, we only have fragments of that information, and, you know, there's millions of people in the past that we don't know what their history is, and, you know, maybe they're not as, what we say, quote unquote, important people because they haven't had, you know, histories written about them. They don't have biographies. Maybe they weren't literate and they didn't keep a documentation of their own life. So how do we make sure that history is, I guess, objective as possible?
Yeah, well, there are a number of issues there. Yeah, you're absolutely right about what we don't know. So there's almost an enforced forgetfulness. In fact, even in the 18th century, there's some poets who wrote about people who they saw in a cemetery, and they said, you know, we're never going to know who these people were. We're never going to know what their lives were like, what they thought, because they're so-called unimportant. They're just an everyday person. So there's that challenge. There's the challenge of motive. Every bit of evidence we have isn't random. It looks random, but it's not, because it has a motive behind it. So every bit of document that we come across, that was created for a reason. So it's not just understanding the evidence, it's understanding the reason for that evidence existing. I think anyone who says we've got a complete history or the perfect history, you've got to treat that with suspicion, because there's no way you can do that. An analogy might be with a criminal case. We don't know all the evidence, we don't have all the facts of what happened, but we can assemble enough evidence and arrange it in a way that leads us to a conclusion. The key difference, of course, is that the jury in a criminal case has to think of what are the consequences to the person being charged. And this is particularly the case, say, in some parts of the world where the death penalty applies. You can look at the evidence and say, I'm 99% sure he killed her, but there's that 1% of doubt, and I don't want him to go to the electric chair because I was 99% sure but not 100% sure. And that nagging little doubt prevents you from going through with the conviction. You won't say he's guilty because he'll be executed, and that will be on your conscience. Historians don't have that concern. We're not concerned about someone dying as a consequence.
You already did.
Well, partly true, yes. And also because our concern is with what's most likely to have happened. So we look at things like the balance of probabilities, and you'll see this language popping up in history, it seems or it appears or most likely or one interpretation or phrases like that. So there's not a lot of hard commitment in some areas, but a preponderance of evidence does suggest certain things, and there's no fear that, oh gosh, we've come to this conclusion, someone's going to be executed or put in prison for 20 years. That's not hanging over our heads, so we can approach it a bit more evenly, as it were.
How do you account for individual, say, historians or individual, you know, members of the public and their own biases in their interpretation of what happened in history? So, you know, when you look back at, you know, previous generations historians of their interpretation of what happened in the past. And I think the common thing that people talk about is those stories of, Mary and Jane were just, you know, very good friends, and they lived together for a very long time, and they lived together in their own home, they died peacefully together. And the interpretation is that Mary and Jane were just very good friends. And, you know, they talk about sort of, I guess, erasure of homosexual identity and all that as well. I think that's a common thing that people talk about as a kind of a joke kind of thing, as the idea that, you know, if historians previously interpreted, that they were just friends and couldn't think that maybe they were actually in a long-term relationship or something, but couldn't be because of the context of the time, it being not legal and not accepted to be in a homosexual relationship. Do you know what I mean? Like, how do you account for that? Because I guess what I'm trying to get at is those previous historians took their own biases and beliefs about society and their interpretations of what happened long before.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
And we all do. There's a social vernacular. There are things you can say to other people and things you probably think in reflection, I ought not to say that because it will cause offence or because it's revolting. We can think of revolting topics now. There's no guarantee that in 100 years from now, those will be seen the same way. And the example you've given illustrates that point. So over time, the moral temperature of a society shifts and it moves about all over the place. And so what's acceptable to one generation might be a virtue, then becomes a vice for a later generation. Historians, by and large, are products of that. So that's inevitable to a degree that you're going to reflect the moral values of the society. But there are moves afoot, and there have been for quite some time actually, to try to distance yourself as much morally from things, and that creates problems too. So if you see a genocide, do you adopt a moral position on it or not? Now, I think all of us who are reasonable would say that's an evil thing. But is that a moral judgment? And is there room for such moral judgments in history? Should we just say this happened for this reason, or should we cast some sort of moral complexion over it? That's a tricky balance.
I guess what I'm hearing is it difficult, because we talked about getting a consensus on history, but then how do we balance getting a consensus on history and allowing for people to have differing views on the same topic?
Yeah, well, a couple of issues there. First, I don't think it's useful to have a consensus, because that implies absolute uniformity of thought. And that's impossible even with the same amount of evidence, because we can approach the same evidence from different perspectives. One of the other problems that emerges from that, though, is the pre-orientation people have to an outcome. So they will say, I want the situation to look like this. I want this to be seen as bad and this to be seen as good. So we will arrange all the elements of history that we have to make it appear that way. And that's quite common. People look for an extra historical end. That is an end to the history, which isn't about history, but about some sort of social justice or political outcome. So that's really the direction some people take history in, and that's not productive at all. That's shifting history into the realm of propaganda.
Well, how do you ensure that you're not doing the same thing that you're talking about right now?
Well, there's a couple of ways, and it's not just me. I think all historians who work in the field tend to, or should do this. Firstly is we have no vested interest in the outcome. And you can test this quite simply. I can read through works and very quickly detect bias in it. The way that things are arranged, the way they're couched, the type of evidence that's used, the weighting that's put on evidence. So you can test that. There's a whole lot of methodological aspects of the discipline that come into play to make sure it's rigorous.
Can you explain a bit further?
Sure. So if you're looking at the war in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, who was responsible? Well, it's very easy to say that group was or that group was. And I've seen histories that do that. And one group is completely wrong and the other group is almost completely virtuous. Wars are far more intricate and nuanced than that, and certainly civil wars are. So good histories will take into account arguments from both sides. They will draw on the sources from Group A and Group B, put them together to see how they work together, to see if there's any problem with that confluence. They will get the evidence of other experts. They'll get historical evidence from earlier periods. They'll look at the value of documentary evidence, look at reliability. They'll look at eyewitness accounts and problems with those. So there's all sorts of tests they put the evidence through. If it's biased, I think it comes with what some people call a sniff test. You can sniff, you can smell that there's something wrong here, that this is really reaching a predetermined outcome. And unfortunately, there are histories like that. And there are people who perhaps don't work in history, but nonetheless produce histories that really are about trying to argue a case. And that's tilting more towards the lawyer's approach, where they're advocating for a client or a cause rather than a more balanced interpretation.
Right, because I think that's something that is of concern, I guess, in the sort of more core science fields as well, especially in like health, where people doing some research and you can see that perhaps they're looking for a particular outcome. And if they get the positive outcome they're looking for, then they're more likely to want to publish it. And then if they're perhaps not getting the positive outcome that they're looking for, then perhaps suppressing that research as well. And I guess that's probably similar to what you're talking about.
Very much so. And it's counterproductive to the discipline. And the other thing too, it actually makes for quite dull reading, because it's almost as though you're being led along on a leash.
Because I guess what I'm worried about is like loss of trust in these institutions as well. Because I guess especially within like this like research science field as well, is that there's this, I don't know, I think it's not very well incentivized. You know, you're incentivized to like publish, and you're also incentivized to publish positive outcomes as well. There's nobody going back and actually redoing the science to, you know, make sure that there's no replication issues as well. Because if you go back and do the exact same study and you get a different outcome, then you're worried that actually are you wrong, or is the previous research, is that wrong? And are we actually testing these ideas again and again in different contexts at different times, and do they actually work?
Well, same thing applies to a degree in history. One of the things that I think is really important is that we can test the history. And I think it's an obligation of every historian who's published something to be available for public scrutiny. So, for example, if I've written a book, someone doesn't like it or challenges the evidence or whatever, they should be free to do that, and I can defend it. I'm happy to do that. There are one or two academics who avoid that. They will publish something but refuse to defend it, and that's a problem. I think.
Have you, while defending your own books, ever changed your mind and realised, oh, maybe I wasn't actually
well,
right?
I haven't had the sort of comment that's led me to that, and that might sound a bit arrogant, but the reason is, there's one book in particular I wrote some years ago, and it caused a bit of fuss. What they didn't realise is, before that book was published, it was almost pressure tested. So it went to a number of academics. I spent the best part of 18 months.
Which book was that?
It was on the Marae language and some of the challenges it faces. And I spent about 18 months arguing with people about it, saying, please find a fault in this, please, and I provoked them and so on. And there were a few bits of fine-tuning I did as a result. And I think that's about 6-7 years ago now. It's still, it had a lot of criticism, but no one actually said this is wrong or this argument is wrong, the evidence is wrong. It was just, I don't like it, and I'll frame my dislike in the form of criticism. And that's reasonably common.
Did they? Why didn't they like it?
I don't know. I remember there's one person who wrote a review saying it was a terrible book, no one should read it, and so on. What puzzled me about that review and actually amused me was that midway through she said, I haven't read it yet. No one's had the courtesy of giving me a copy, but nonetheless it's a terrible book. And I thought, all you can do is smile. That's a bit silly, but that was the quality of criticism.
So I want to talk a little bit more about, I guess, what's like a hot topic, I guess, right now in Western world, I guess, as well. When we hear a lot from politicians, media, and in the healthcare setting as well about the impacts of colonisation on Indigenous peoples. And I think it's pretty well documented, the impacts that it has had on Indigenous people sort of around the world. We talk about things like land dispossession, suppression of culture and language, and that loss of identity as well, and how that affects people in the past and also the people of today, the descendants of the Indigenous people. We attribute a lot of this to like worsening health outcomes, which I can understand why they can cause those worse health outcomes. In the context of New Zealand, for example, I know that for periods of time throughout recent history, I believe in the early 20th century, there were events where during various epidemics, there were separate hospitals for Māori and non-Māori. So clearly there was, differential treatment based on ethnicity here, which is, hugely damaging, and that probably has impacts on how people today feel about engaging with what we say Western or conventional health as well. I think one of the things as well is that we assume that colonisation was a thing of the past, and it obviously has the impacts today, and we kind of think that this is the last time there's going to be colonisation. I think there's this naivety that was something that happened in the past, and maybe it's not going to happen again in the future, and all we have to do is continue to talk about what happened in the past, but it's not going to happen in the future. Can you help me and others sort of make sense of what were the drivers of colonisation in the past? How was it that the British subjects of the British Empire felt that it was an acceptable thing to do?
Okay. Well, there is a caricature history of colonisation, which is that there's this evil colonial power, and it decides that it's going to go out and conquer other countries. It's going to subjugate the Indigenous populations. It's going to claim those colonies as part of its empire. It's going to strip all the resources out of the place, maybe settle it with some of its own people and so on. And that's I think the popular caricature, the cartoon version of colonisation. The problem is it doesn't always square up with history, and New Zealand's a very good example of that. So the Dutch arrived here in 1642. Abel Tasman came here. He was commissioned by the Dutch East India Company, probably the biggest commercial enterprise in the world at the time, very powerful. And what did they do? They decided we're not interested in colonising New Zealand. 3 years later, they had distributed the map showing where New Zealand was throughout Europe.
Did they say why they weren't interested?
What's the point? That was it. There's no commercial gain to be had. This goes to this misconception that people think that imperial powers just want to keep consuming territory. So Europe knew by, say, 1646 where New Zealand was. The Spanish took no effort to colonise New Zealand. The Dutch obviously didn't. The French didn't. The English didn't either. So the English knew about New Zealand since the 1640s, mid-1640s. It wasn't until 1768, so well over 100 years later, that they actually sent an expedition here. And the instructions that Cook was given was that you were to claim sovereignty over New Zealand, and the phrase that was used was with the consent of the natives. So not to conquer it, but to claim sovereignty with the consent of the natives. And of course, Britain didn't regard New Zealand as a colony in the 18th century. So here we are, well over 100 years later, no one in Europe's keen to colonise New Zealand. So this idea that there's this avaricious monster consuming as much territory doesn't square up with the facts. Then we jump into the 19th century, and up until about 1838, 1839, just before the treaty, British policy was really clear. We don't want to get involved in New Zealand. Britain did everything it could to avoid committing to the country, to avoid colonising it, because there was no reason to. There was good trade between New Zealand and New South Wales at that time. There was some settlement.
Like by the Māori people at the time?
Yeah. So various hapu were supplying vast amounts of food. Hapu production of food by the 1830s, particularly in Northland, really was on an industrial scale. It wasn't cottage garden stuff. This was mass production for the Sydney market. The British were happy with that. Those hapu were happy with that. Why intervene? Why rock the boat? Why go to the massive expense? And the answer is that Britain needed to exercise jurisdiction over its population living here because it was effectively lawless. And some of the worst sort of people you can imagine settled in New Zealand, escaped convicts, former convicts, and so on. And they were causing problems not just among themselves, but with some Maori communities as well. And there were pleas from missionaries, something has to be done. Either you stop colonisation, you stop people arriving, or you allow British law to apply to those people. And so the treaty was a vehicle initially for Britain to exercise its jurisdiction over its population living in the country. So the caricature of colonisation doesn't play out in New Zealand. It does in other parts of the world. Spanish colonisation was very much an aggressive, genocidal process in many cases. In New Zealand, there was great reluctance. And of course, Britain didn't even have a policy about empire. I mean, at the end of the 19th century, one British historian said, it's a very famous quote, he said, the empire was acquired in a fit of absence of mind. That there was no plan, there was no grand strategy, there was no centre of power. If you look at New Zealand's Declaration of Independence and the fact that we had a resident here appointed in 1833, that wasn't British policy, that was policy from that person. He went to London and said, I think you need to appoint me here. He pressured officials and they said, okay, we'll do that. So the periphery actually influenced policy as much as the core. It's organic. It's like an ecosystem with no centre of intelligence, and that was its strength. The British Empire was strong because it didn't have a plan or a policy to conquer all these territories. It just let things evolve naturally, and that meant if things went wrong, well, so be it. In fact, almost you could say nothing could go wrong because there's no definition of right or wrong. It's just, we'll try this. If it doesn't work, we'll try that. And in that chaos and that almost P.G. Woodhouse type world of policy making, countries got drawn into the empire. In other cases, it was far more brutal, and it was certainly brutal here in the 1860s. But in that initial period, say from the 1640s, when the English first knew about New Zealand, right up until about the 1850s, Britain was a reluctant interventionist.
Well, what changed then? Because obviously, you say the signing of the Te Tiriti and the Treaty of Waitangi, the intention there wasn't to colonise New Zealand. What changed?
Yeah, there's a big argument about who ceded what. Did the chiefs cede sovereignty? I think it's pretty plain from the documentation from the British government that they didn't actually want the chiefs to cede sovereignty. They said, we want jurisdiction over this problematic, roughly 2,000 settlers living in the country. We need to apply our law and order to them, but we can't because this is a foreign territory. So they needed the permission of the chiefs to do that. I think it's a big stretch to claim that the chiefs, 542 of them, suddenly said, we're giving up our sovereignty as well. And certainly subsequent to the treaty, all the signs were they didn't believe they had. And in fact, for a couple of years afterwards, even the British said, look, apart from serious crimes like murder, we're happy for Marae to govern themselves. So that's the snapshot in 1840. That's what's known as an originalist interpretation, what the treaty tried to achieve in its original version at the time. But life's not a snapshot, it's more like a film. So we have to take into account all the events that took place afterwards. And what we see for the rest of the 19th century, more or less, is a process of acquiescence where many Maori communities acquiesce to Crown sovereignty, some through force at the barrel of a gun, but most through a very sort of informal process of de facto accepting Crown sovereignty. So by the end of the 19th century, Crown sovereignty applies almost over the entirety of the country. There's a few tiny pockets where it doesn't, but generally it does. And that's really how that sovereignty evolved in the subsequent 60 years from the signing of the treaty.
Because I understand that the signing of the treaty, there was about 1,000 British subjects, I think, in New Zealand.
Yeah, it varies, up to about 1,500 or 2,000.
Something like that. But then after that, sort of the floodgates opened and there were a significant amount of British colonisers that came after that, isn't there?
Absolutely. And, of course, demographics affects that relationship. So by the end of the 19th century, you might have 42,000 Māori and well over 700,000 Europeans. Well, you can tell where the political power lies then, because the sheer number of migrants affected who wields authority in the country.
I think it's an interesting thing to think about when it comes to colonisation, because I think about if we roll the clock back even further to what people did before colonisation. And this is my interpretation, which is that before colonisation, people, instead of just colonising places and being like, okay, we're just going to live here now and introducing more and more new people to new areas, new areas were taken by conquest rather than colonisation. There was a lot more, overt violence that was, you think about the Roman Empire, and that was, quite a while back, and people often talk about the Roman Empire with a lot of fondness. Oh, the Roman Empire, they did so many great things, and look at like this architecture that's Roman and these technologies that are Roman, blah, 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 and oh, look at these like Roman ruins that are in this country that's quite far away from Rome, and not really thinking about the fact that actually to get there, the Roman Empire had to do that through a lot of violence to actually take over these areas. And so that's what people did before. And I guess, I don't know, with colonisation, there is obviously violence as well, but before that, people just took over countries through abject violence.
Yeah, it seems to be part of the human condition. It's a really unfortunate part of the human condition, but it's there. And you're right, throughout history, you see that pattern of we will expand into here for military power or economic interests, overpopulation, vengeance, whatever. And that just seems to happen over and over again. Of course, by the 19th century, it's far more intricate because it's not just territorial acquisition, but it's also cultural change as well. And one of the arguments about, and you mentioned earlier about colonisation continuing, one of the arguments is that eventually it will come to an end culturally because, and maybe we're in that phase already, that if you look at young people, what sort of music they listen to, the entertainment and so on, it's becoming far more universal than it ever was. And one way of looking at colonisation is a way of achieving an equilibrium. So if country A has all this technology and country B doesn't, what happens when they meet? Well, there's going to be a balance point at some stage. They're going to both end up with roughly the same technology. We've now reached that balance point universally around the world, that most countries in the world have smartphones, for example, and access to the internet and so on. So the disparities that led to cultural colonisation pretty much exhausted in some areas anyway.
So if I had to explain to my own children one day, like why colonisation happened, like how should I explain it to them?
I'd start off by saying it's not a single process. Colonisation is a term rather like a bucket that you can put all sorts of bits of events into. If you look at British colonisation of New Zealand in the late 1830s, there were various groups, mainly missionary groups, who were saying there should be no immigration to New Zealand, no European immigration. We should stop this, it's doing damage. There are groups from the colonising power saying, don't get involved. There are merchants saying we should only have limited contact. There are some people saying, well, we should do much more. So even in a very small example, there are all sorts of different opinions within that big bucket we call colonisation. So it's not a unitary thing. It looks like it in hindsight, Group A came to Country B. But it's far more intricate and complex than that. And it's the sum total of all these conflicting motives and actions.
How do we deal with, I guess, all the negative impacts of colonisation? Obviously, there are a lot of people talking today about how much hurt they and their families have experienced under various stages, I guess, of colonisation. Like, how do we, reconcile that?
It's interesting to consider that just about every country on earth has been colonised. Just about every single one. And many more than once. So if you ask that question, how do we deal with colonisation, that becomes a universal human question. How does everyone in the world deal with it? How do all these countries deal with the fact they're being colonised? And it seems to be historically that there's an expiry date on the issues that colonisation causes, both good and bad. So does colonisation cause ruptures to societies? Of course it does. Does it cause some groups to be subjugated? Of course it does. But there is an expiry date on this, and that's been the experience without exception around the world, that at some point, we don't know how long that expiry date is or when it arrives, but around the world that's been the case, because as I say, just about every country has been colonised.
What do you mean by an expiry date?
At a point at which you no longer say, well, look, we've got to address issues from the past. So you mentioned, for example, the Romans when they invaded Britain, say. I don't think you'll find many Britons now saying, look, we need to deal with Italy. We need to get compensation from Italy for this invasion, whenever it was, a couple of thousand years ago. Because the consequences of it are no longer detectable in a distinct way. So what happens is, yes, a whole lot of horrible things happened in England when the Romans invaded, mass killings, mass destruction. But over time, that gets forgotten, and it doesn't get forgotten completely, but the consequences of it tend to diminish after each generation. And that's a process in most countries, but it's culturally distinct in certain areas. So you can look at, again, part of the Balkans, for example, the Middle East. Some cultures have transmission mechanisms that transmit the grievance through generations. So events that happened in southern Serbia in 1389 are still vibrant and crucial to a lot of people in the area. People in the West would look at that and say, well, look, that's so many hundreds of years ago. Why would you even bother? But different cultures have different ways of remembering the past. And you could argue that some Western cultures have a sort of enforced forgetfulness, that they deliberately exclude past experiences because it becomes a hindrance in some ways. So cultural issues affect how we recall the past, how we place value on it, and what effects that process has on us in terms of actions and senses of what to do now.
I think it's important to learn, though, about the eras, I guess, of the previous colonisation. I just came back from China, during this just weekend. I was visiting family. I'm from an area called Sichuan, one of the provinces, and from a city called, my family are from this area, from Tindu. I was born in New Zealand, so I've spent time there visiting family and all that, and it's been 8 years. We have a local dialect called Sichuanese, and my parents speak it. I understand it, but I speak Mandarin at home. And when I was there, it was really great for me personally to be around family and seeing people that look like me, and understanding more about where I came from and where I get my big personality from, why I'm so loud. Oh, my whole family's loud. Oh yeah, this all makes sense. And what I thought was quite interesting is that my cousins' kids, who are 9 and 12, they spoke Mandarin. They didn't speak Sichuanese. And I just thought, this is strange. I mean, I only speak Mandarin because my parents realized, I'm not going to be able to play with any other Chinese kids from other provinces, because it's different. It's a slightly different language they wouldn't understand. And I asked my cousins about it. I was like, do they not speak Sichuanese? And my cousins are saying, the schools are basically banning Sichuanese, which is it's so core, I think, to the culture of our people. It makes you can't, in this language, you can't not be loud and expressive, with how you feel. And it's such a beautiful language for me to listen to. And I just couldn't believe it that, young kids, they for some reason chose to only speak Mandarin at home as well. And I said to them, no, at home you need to speak Sichuanese to keep that language alive, because we're at risk of losing this. And I think when people talk about colonisation, I think it's very Eurocentric, at least when you talk about it in the context of New Zealand, Australia, US. It's very ethnocentric to European colonisation. But I don't think that they've realised that colonisation is not something that is, an only European thing. People have done it before, and people will continue to do it in the future if we're not careful about it. And I don't think people know much about China. China itself, it's so ethnically diverse. People have no idea. People think all people in China look I guess like people like me who I guess I haven't asked my dad about it, what is like Han ethnicity? And like Han ethnicity is, Dad's like, oh, it's actually a made up term. Like it's not really like a real ethnicity. But, you know, there are provinces in China with like 50 different ethnic minorities. And it's like people just don't know. Like if you go there will be places where you can learn about, you know, the ethnic minority groups. But if you actually look into it further, a lot of them have worse economic opportunities because they're not allowed to like move into the city. And there's all these different things that give different rights to people who are of these ethnic minorities than not. And what am I trying to say here? Like it's just these patterns of colonization, you could call. Like it's not just owned by Europeans. Like everyone else is just as capable of what we say colonization to other people that they see are different. Yeah,
very much so. And over time it's changed. You look at the classical world, it's very much a military sort of colonization. You've talked about linguistic processes at work where the state or whatever else decides, well, this language takes priority, and of course that colonizes the minority indigenous language in some cases. There's cultural colonization as well. There's economic dependency. A lot of Latin American economists in the 60s wrote about colonization through capitalism. So there's all sorts of different forms, and that muddies the waters even more when we talk about the term. It's just so broad that it almost defies single meaning.
So another question I want to ask, assuming that you're a professor at Auckland University of Technology, I'm assuming that you have some international students from time to time, people who have never been to New Zealand, who might not know much about New Zealand's history. Like, how do you approach Te Tiriti or the Treaty of Waitangi for international students? Like, how do you educate them about what it means for contemporary New Zealand?
Well, if they enrol on, we have a paper on it, funny enough, and if they enrol on it, then they learn about a bit about the history, about its subsequent breaches, and about attempts to remedy those breaches from the later part of the 20th century. So they get an overview of the various stages, what the treaty meant, what the intentions of the parties were, how the Crown really broke the treaty in just about every conceivable way over decades and decades, how it effectively buried it constitutionally. And then attempts from the late 60s, early 70s to revive the treaty to provide some sort of remedy. So students who finish that paper end up with a sense of this is what happened, this is what went wrong, these are attempts to fix it. The attempts can never be ideal. You can't really remedy something that's been broken where a lot of the people no longer are around. You can offer compensation, you can try to offer some sort of solace, but you can't undo history, and that's one of the problems. And so if you come from a background where you've experienced something terrible, an egregious breach of your rights involving the death of your ancestors, nothing can alter that. And so that grievance can tend to last for quite some time. So understanding the nature of grievance is quite important too. And that's something that we consider as well.
And I think that education is really important, especially when I talk about international students, I'm also talking about, I guess, new immigrants who are coming into the country as well. And I spoke previously about this with Shamabil on my podcast about the changing demographics. So because of the reduced fertility rate in a lot of advanced economies, we're reliant on immigration to bring new people in. And I don't have a problem with immigration, but I think I have a problem with how we do it. Because I guess if we don't have that open ability to talk about the treaty, like just the way that you've explained it and talking about, this is what happened, this is what happened afterwards, and these are the results, and this is what we've tried to do to ameliorate the situation. I worry that if we're not proactive about educating people about this as they come into the country and talking about this kind of stuff, you're going to get more and more people who don't understand what the point is of this piece of paper that was signed, in 1840. That's my concern, I guess. We're not opening up that conversation to people who are new into the country.
I think in a way, for some groups, the ship's already sailed in the sense that anecdotally, groups I've talked to and groups have talked to me about things have said, look, our community knows nothing about it. And they said, would you be interested in talking to them about it? And I said, well, my question always is, do they want to know about it? And the answer is no. So for a lot of people, and not just immigrants, but people born here, there is no interest in the treaty whatsoever. And it's seen as, you can see it's on social media, it's depicted as being divisive or out of date or some sort of radical agenda or whatever else. And so there's a growing sense that people are saying, well, look, we've had enough. And that's really unfortunate because, we know why that happens, but it's unfortunate that it is happening. And you get a big sector of the community as a result that has no interest in the topic, certainly doesn't feel bound by its provisions, certainly isn't curious to find out more about it.
Or learn from the past.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Which I guess brings me to the next thing that we want to talk about, which is, the elephant in the room really is the ACT Party's Treaty Principles Bill. Whether or not it's the right thing or the wrong thing, I think a lot of people are very unhappy about the Treaty Principles Bill. What I want to understand is, how did we get here? Why is it that some people think that this is an important thing to do? And what happened in the past that maybe encouraged people to think this way?
Very quick history lesson. Roughly from about 1845 to 1975, in very crude terms, the treaty went into a sort of constitutional hibernation that the Crown
basically
almost completely
ignored it.
Disregarded. Yeah. Where is it? Well, it's somewhere. It's in a book somewhere. You can read it, but it certainly has no influence on, if you look at the late 19th century, early 20th century, no influence whatsoever in government policy. No one says, well, what would the treaty require us to do? That's not a consideration for successive governments. And really, in the early 70s, there's a revival of interest in the treaty, and that culminates in 1975 with the creation of the Waitangi Tribunal, which has two functions: to deal with treaty grievances, with breaches of the treaty, which I think everyone knows about. But another function was to work out what the treaty means. Because in the 70s, there just was so little scholarship on it, no one could agree. In fact, if you look at activists, Marae activist groups at the time, some would have protests with banners saying honour the treaty. Others would have protests with banners saying the treaty is a fraud.
Really?
Because no one could settle on what this document was about and whose interest did it serve, what was its significance. Everyone had their own views, but they were poorly developed. The Crown acknowledged this, and the Crown said, well, look, we're going to require the tribunal to develop principles. We can't make head or tail of the text, we can't reconcile it, but we will try to work out what's the essence of it. Those principles have come to act as a sort of a de facto amendment process. So in the United States, for example, the Constitution, when women got the right to vote, when was it, 1922, I think, there's an amendment to the Constitution that explicitly says women are allowed to vote. It's very clear, there's no ambiguity. So that amendment was passed and the Constitution was altered accordingly. We don't have that with our constitutional document, the treaty, if you regard it as a constitutional document. We don't have a formal process of amending it. We have a far more flexible process, let's call it that, where principles are added so we can apply an 1840 agreement to current situations. So, for example, radio frequencies. Can you claim for radio frequencies under the treaty? Well, if you take an originalist view, you look at the text, the argument has to be no, because no one mentioned radio frequencies in the treaty. It's not there. But things have changed since then. So if we become aware of things like radio frequencies now and they earn revenue, who owns them? The Crown or iwi? How does that work out? So because there are changes in science and technology and so forth in society since 1840, the treaty needs to accommodate those changes. And so principles are a way of doing that. We'll come up with a principle that allows us to apply that 1840 document to now. And that's an informal amendment process. Now, inevitably, it's quite relaxed, and as a consequence of being relaxed, some people feel, well, these principles can be applied in areas I'm not comfortable with. Imagine if you had an amendment to the US Constitution that said we might possibly do this. Well, that's not good enough.
Too ambiguous.
Yeah, we need something that's more explicit. So as I understand it, Act's Bill is designed to clarify what those principles are. Now, there are some risks in that. Firstly, they're limited to, I think, to about 3 principles, whereas there are many other principles in existence at the moment. So what happens to them? Secondly, if you legislate for the principles, you're losing that flexibility. You're making them much more rigid. Thirdly, you open the door at this point for a party of another political persuasion in the future to say, look, we're going to amend this act and do the exact opposite of what you did. So for all sorts of reasons, it's a challenging area. And I'm not sure what the motive is for ACT, because they know very well that the bill won't pass through into legislation. That's very clear. So I'm a bit puzzled by that. But I think there are fishhooks attached with this sort of thing. And it does, however, emphasise the fact that there is uncertainty about the extent to which the principles apply or what they mean.
Do you think any of this is to do with, I guess, people's inability to talk about the treaty and the history of colonisation like openly and frankly? Because
Quite possibly.
From when I listen to David Seymour talk about this stuff, he talks a lot about having the debate on what the treaty or Te Tiriti means to New Zealand culture today. That's part of what I'm hearing about it.
Yeah, I mean, some people have stood up and been prepared to debate, but a lot of people have just dug themselves deeper into their trenches and said, this is where we stand and we're not moving.
On both sides.
And of course, yes. And that's not helpful. The problem is when people say we need a debate or a discussion about this, that's very easy to say, but what's the mechanism for that? Where does that take place? Who are the honest actors? Where's the genuine inquiry into finding out?
Who's going to facilitate the debate?
Yeah, that sort of thing. And unfortunately, sometimes these things turn into a sort of a bit of a circus, really, where people parade something or people see this as a chance for me to advocate my view. My view, for example, is completely irrelevant to anyone. It's just my view. It doesn't matter. What does matter is how we address the evidence, and that's critical. And that's often the first victim of these sorts of discussions, that people really have two ideological positions they're never going to meet.
Could you maybe steelman for me? Give me the best good faith argument for why the ACT Party and David Seymour want to push something like the Treaty Principles Bill.
Well, from what I've heard from ACT, my understanding is that they want these principles defined so that, and there's a subtext here of not wanting a separatist system or a two-sovereign system or something like that. So if you look at the bill itself, the big emphasis really is on having a unitary sovereign state, and the argument is that, I think David Seymour made this point recently, that there's no country on earth really that's done well with two separate sovereign groups operating within one jurisdiction. It's very difficult to manage. So there's that. And I think also that, and this is a terrible thing to say, but on both sides, people have used the principles argument, and I'm not saying that members of ACT or any members of any other group are doing this, but there are some individuals who use it as a camouflage for racism, that they have racist views and they can't express them, but they can use the treaty principles or treaty arguments as a cipher to get across their views. They can start to use it as a stick to beat people with, while all the time saying, I'm not racist, it's not about race, it's about the treaty. But the treaty is used as a vehicle to get for them to express their racism. And this is across the spectrum, by the way. And so these are concerns as well. So when we listen to the debate, you have to sort of sift through what people are saying, and it goes back to the earlier point, what are the motives for what they're saying?
I mean, I feel like every time people bring up the treaty, you could just feel everyone just like clench, everyone just feels like really tense. And I don't know, I wasn't very politically conscious, I would say 10 years ago, but it didn't feel like we were, at such, tension, like culturally in society 10 years ago. Like, do you agree with that? Or do you feel like it's always been of a very contentious topic?
It's very hard to tell because we tend to wrap up adverse memories from the past in a sort of cotton wool.
Like with nostalgia as well.
Yeah. That phrase, we'll look back on this one day and laugh, when something bad happens. And it's true, we do that. The fact of the event hasn't changed, but the perspective of it has. And so there's always a tendency to see that the present as being a bit more alarmist or a bit more dramatic than perhaps it is. But certainly some people have made some unfortunate statements and some extreme statements. And my question is for them is it evidence-based, and what's the motive? If the motive is to inflame opinion or to rally the troops or to consolidate your support, well, I understand that. But I think we need to be a bit more mature and say, look, the real issue is, what is the nature of this agreement? How does it work? For whose benefit? In what way? And how do we avoid people feeling alienated in the process? Across the spectrum again. It's not just about one group feeling alienated. It's about everyone. And so these are big challenges. And they require honest conversations. And that's a commodity that's in short supply.
And I think it's hard because I feel like I've spent a lot of time, personally, I think I've spent a lot of time trying to read about things around the treaty or Te Tiriti and about the history of colonisation in New Zealand. And I feel like I don't have a firm grasp on everything. I don't have a firm grasp on, the actual text in the articles or the principles from 1975 or around thereabouts or what's going on in the Treaty Principles Bill. But yet there's this pressure on people to already know what they're talking about right now, and they might not have actually spent much time actually looking things up.
And that's challenging. I mean, one of the problems too, of course, is that this treaty was designed in the late 1830s, 1839 actually, came to fruition in 1840. It's a very different moral world from the one we live in, very different in all sorts of ways.
Because what I'm more interested in as a paediatric emergency doctor is trying to figure out what is actually going to help my patients do better. And I'm trying to figure out how in this debate are we actually going to improve outcomes for Māori and Pacifica and, all the different groups that, don't do as well. Because there's a whole plethora of health issues that are socioeconomic as well. And it's just really hard to figure out how spending so much energy talking about this new bill is actually going to improve outcomes for anyone.
Yeah, and there are big ideological issues around that, about whether or not certain groups, their particular disadvantage is causative or correlative or combinations of the both. There are issues about equality before the law, but there are also issues about needs, and does enforced equality wipe out the fact that some groups have specific needs? Are there particular needs deriving from being Indigenous that aren't being considered? What happens to the Indigenous language, for example? You could say, well, let's treat all people equally, but then that's a good recipe to get rid of te reo, because if you treat it like anything else without the necessary support mechanisms, it won't survive. So there are real challenges in all this. The question is, though, do we bring it back to the treaty? Is the treaty axiomatic for all these considerations, or can we deal with them without the treaty? And if we can, that might be an opportunity. If we say, look, this is where the need is, this particular group or this cultural group, whatever, has XYZ needs, we will target resources to deal with that. That might work. I don't know. I know very little about the health sector, but it might work. It would seem to me, just as a layperson, if there's a need there, we will address the need, whichever group it is. When you bring the treaty into it, it's often used as a sort of a strong arm measure that, you have to do this because of the treaty. I would have thought you have to do it because it's the decent thing to do to help a group that has needs. So if one group's overrepresented in obesity or smoking or kidney failure or something, then you direct resources to that group. That would have seemed the common sense thing to do. One of the problems with using the treaty as a sort of a strong arm tactic is that it stretches the elasticity of the agreement almost to the point where it has no meaning. So anything can become a treaty issue, and therefore nothing is a treaty issue. It's just the blanket that covers everything. And we lose a lot of the essence. We certainly lose the commitment that the chiefs who signed it made and what their thinking was. That seems to me to be central to the agreement. And I think Heitia, before he passed away, the leader of Kingitanga, made that point. It's really what the agreement says and what the chiefs committed to. That's the essence of it.
I saw that you've also been doing some relatively frequent talks at Marae around New Zealand. What are you talking about when you go to Marae, and what how is what you're talking about received, and what are you learning from the experience?
Well, I've been invited by various Marae to talk about treaty issues and talk a bit about the history of it. Seems to be well received in the sense that I keep getting invited back. So there's one I've been back to, I think, 10 times now. So that's some indication, I think, that they're keen on it. I think people just want an honest discussion about the treaty, and they want a chance to express their views about it. The other thing, one of the things I've learned, of course, travelling around the country, is that there are very different needs in different parts of the country, very different perceptions of the treaty. And also, and this is just a personal observation, I think a lot of marae are in real danger at the moment, because particularly some of the more remote rural ones I've been to, there's a few elderly people, one or two elderly people, and by elderly I mean in their 80s, who are really struggling. They do a lot of the work at the marae. There's some people who help, but they're there on call all the time. Now, when they pass away, who's going to replace them? And I've asked them this, and a lot of them don't know. They would dearly love someone to be able to fulfill that role, but there isn't anyone available. And maybe some encouraging government might think, well, look, we could partially fund positions for Marae so that we can keep these institutions going. They're vitally important, but it's just they're in very depopulated, economically depressed areas, and it's hard for them to function.
Gosh, so basically you're saying that in these marae, which are sort of centres of these very rural communities, these elders who are probably also the holders of a lot of oral history and tradition as well within those communities, it kind of, the culture of that iwi or that hapu is sort of reliant on that one person who's might not be around in 10 years' time.
Well, one kaumātua said to me, what worries him the most when he dies is who's going to be there to organise tangi, for example, because someone from Auckland will come down and say, look, we're bringing the body down on Thursday for the tangi, and then even now there are cases where we have to organise who's going to do what, and it becomes a problem because there's very few people back home to take care of that. And there are various reasons for it, but there are remedies available, I'm sure. And I think it would be a terrible loss if 10 years from now people say, if only we'd done this. Because that transmission of knowledge from those kaumātua to the next generation, I think, is central to those marae prospering in the future. And if we lose it, if we break the chain, it's very hard to repair afterwards.
So I think it is also a symptom of the wider issue of the rural-urban divide as well, because if you don't have those economic opportunities in rural areas, like in general, like the problems of marae being able to be sustainable, that's just one of the many symptoms that we have of the problem of rural areas just not having that economic sustainability.
But governments can subsidise this, they can incentivise this, and it's been done all over the world in various ways, so there's no reason why it couldn't happen here.
Very good, yeah. So I'll just change tack a little bit to, I guess, more about your role as an academic and talking about academic freedom. So, I mean, you talked before about this book that you'd written, where there were people who were giving quite scathing reviews, having not even read your book in the first place. Like, do you feel that there's less of an appetite to hear alternative views and actually examine evidence that might oppose people's own biases, beliefs and expectations?
There's a very small minority of people who also happen to be very vocal, and they have a particular view of the world. There's lots of clusters of people like this. And if you say something that's slightly out of step with their thinking, they'll make the world know about it. And social media has been very helpful in that. And some of these people are quite clever operators. They know how to inflame views on social media. They know how to access, in New Zealand's case, hundreds of thousands of people and advertise their views to them. I'm certainly not intimidated by that, and I can't make choices about evidence based on what someone might or might not like. That's a silly thing to do because immediately that will become apparent in the book. So my approach always has been to make the evidence stand up for itself. And if I'm wrong, I'm happy to be shown where I'm wrong. And I invite people to say, look, you made this mistake here, or this interpretation should be like this, or what about this document, and so on. That's part of the natural process of history, that you consider information all the time and new information comes to light. But most of the attacks I've got have been basically because people don't like even topics being addressed, let alone what the argument is. And that's unfortunate for them, but in an adult world, you've just got to deal with that. This is going to happen. There will be research done on certain things. If you're not happy about it, explain why. Just be a bit more articulate, but clearer with the evidence. What do you dislike about this? So, and I think the environment's become more hostile. I know Michael King, a historian, and he mentioned to me years ago, 27 years ago.
To be clear, not Michael King of the I Am Hope, Michael King the historian.
Yeah. And he said that he was basically moving away from topics involving Marae because he got so much flack, and that was nearly 30 years ago. So, I think the environment's become a bit.
Do you think part of it is the I guess the shorthand version people talk about is identity politics, and the way that, you just said that you've been invited on Marae many, many times and spoken to a lot of kaumātua about the treaty. And I guess there's probably this sense that, Paul Moon, he's just this white guy coming along talking about the treaty. What does he have to say about it? Do you think that's part of it as well?
I sense it might be with some people. I mean, I've spent 30 years in the archives, so I do know one or two things about the treaty. Again, it boils down to if you disagree with me, I'm happy with that. That's not a problem. I would expect, though, there's a reason that you disagree with me, not just because my complexion or something. And you need to be a bit more substantial than that. And I think it's a bit embarrassing when people make the argument, and that argument has cropped up from time to time. Because my response is that all you've got, really? I mean, you must have something more substantial. And engage in the evidence, engage in ideas, and who knows what will happen then. But simply name calling, I sometimes get asked, does it bother me? The answer is no, it doesn't, because I just don't give it any regard whatsoever.
You also wrote a biography about Anne Wester. I think you mentioned before we were talking about this. I think was she Dutch, a Dutch photographer,
Dutch, yeah.
And I think there was a bit of a backlash because people were like, what is she doing with these pictures of like Māori people and profiting off them? I think probably is what they were saying, things like that. But I also spoke with a friend of mine who's also Māori, and he was saying that his particular hapua iwi really welcomed having aunts there. They loved her. They thought it was awesome to have somebody come along and actually document Māori life in the way that she documented them. And I mean, I'm not on top of it. I haven't read your book, but I can understand how there could be like mixed feelings about people saying, but I don't know.
Yeah, that was odd. So what my particular sin was there was not that I was writing about a Māori topic, but I was writing about someone who had dealings with some hapu. And so that in itself was apparently a grave thing to do. It's very interesting because every single person I talk to who has members of their whānau or their hapu represented in those pictures that she took, and she didn't profit from them, quite the opposite. She lived for a while in quite substantial poverty, and although she never made it public, she actually donated money from any sales of photographs to those whānau themselves. So it certainly wasn't for profit. But I've talked to members of them, and without exception, the ones I've talked to have said she gave us presence where otherwise there would be absence, that we now have a record of our ancestors in the 1960s or 1970s where otherwise we wouldn't know. And it's so treasured by them. Some of them have used some of those photographs on tombstones for those ancestors when they've died. So the people concerned are really, really, without exception, as I say, they're really grateful for those images. They're hugely important. They weren't done in a sensationalist way. They weren't done to make money or to boost a career. They were genuinely done out of the photographer's interest in the people. And she established lifelong friendships with all of these people. Now, some people are uncomfortable about that. Well, so be it.
I worry that there's this thing where people jump to conclusions a lot about like, you're not part of this group, therefore you shouldn't be involved with this group. Or that there's a framing of, if you are part of this group, you need to behave a certain way, or stories about you have to be written a certain way. I watched this TV show, which is they turned a book into a TV show, and it was sort of like a romance tragedy kind of TV show on Netflix. And in the book, it was about, a boy and a girl. One was working class, one was, upper class, and it wasn't really mentioned specifically what ethnicity they were, but it was based in England. And in the TV show, the lead female character was cast as she was an Indian actress, but none of the TV show was really about like her ethnicity or anything like that. It was just about two young people trying to figure things out. And one of the reviews that I read about it was saying like, this isn't a criticism, but, saying that actually, this TV show, it didn't explore, this actress was really good in the role, but they didn't explore her ethnic identity in this TV show. And I just think she's a really good actress. The story is not about, different ethnicity stories. It's a little bit about class, but, it's about two young people trying to figure it out in their like love story. Like it doesn't, not anything that has somebody who's, a person of colour or an Indigenous person or whatever in the story. Like it doesn't, it's 2024, like it doesn't have to be about like their ethnicity anymore. That you can still cast a person who's of this specific group in a different group and make it not be about race or ethnicity anymore. Like it'd be important to have those ethnicity stories, like things like Crazy Rich Asians, like those movies, or like The Farewell, like these movies that really speak to me. It's like, there's representation, Asian representation in Hollywood. Like that's awesome. But also it'd be great to see stories where it doesn't have to be about my ethnicity, or it doesn't have to be about a person's ethnicity anymore,
Yeah, there are people who go through life looking at everything through a so-called ethnic lens. I say so-called because ethnicity itself is extremely complicated, and one of the risks is we compartmentalise it. So all Chinese people are like this, all Indian people are like this, because that's the lens we look through. That denies diversity in those groups, and every group has the maximum spectrum of diversity in it. So you might meet a Dutch person who has very close interests to you. You resonate in the way you see the world very closely. You might find someone from your own culture who you disagree with and don't have anything in common. And this is the way things work. It's far more complicated than saying, well, you belong to this group, you must perform in that way and behave in that way. That's a stereotype, and it's not helpful.
We got a little bit sidetracked from what I was talking about, which was the topic of academic freedom. So, the reason why I want to talk about it is because I'm a little bit concerned about authoritarian style behavior within, different domains of life. We obviously can talk about it in the domain of politics. That's the obvious place. But I think I'm also kind of seeing it in healthcare and also in academia. When I talk about authoritarianism, what I'm talking about is, the idea that we all should believe one way of thinking, one idea, one set of ideas, one ideology, one set of values, one set of these are the facts, and you cannot question them. And I guess my concern is that universities specifically are supposed to be the conscience. The critic and conscience, right? The critic and conscience of society. Universities are supposed to be the place that go and question the orthodoxy and all sides of the political spectrum and all topics very widely. And what I'm concerned about is that we're not actually doing that anymore. That if you, like you said before, if you step slightly out of step with the narrative that people are trying to promote, then you're sort of excommunicated from the group.
I was probably never in the group, so good luck excommunicating. I think, there are concerns. One of the things with history is it is a contest of ideas and a contest of evidence and all the different ways you can approach assembling the evidence and so on. And there are problems. And I don't think, where I work, I haven't been subjected to any pressure whatsoever from my employer, but I've been subject to enormous pressure from people outside the university. People decide, for whatever reason, they're not happy with me. And there are ways of dealing with that, and they range from ignoring people to, if someone makes a more serious allegation or something, then we take legal action against them. There's been 5 or 6 individuals who have been dealt with that way because we have laws in this country when it comes to defamation. So there are various ways of dealing with it, but my preference is never to do that if I can avoid it, and I turn the other cheek. So if someone says something horrible about me, well, okay, so be it. That's not the end of the world. When it comes to other disciplines, though, maybe there is that pressure that's being exerted. And there are narratives. There are narratives that permeate universities. In my field, I write what the evidence shows, and that's as simple as that. And if you're not happy with it, well, show me where I'm wrong. That's sort of my ongoing challenge, as it were.
I feel like within healthcare, it's not something that was really there before, but I think it's increasing. I mentioned to you before we started recording about this concept called health at every size, which is, when I looked into it, it's just this very ideologically led sort of activism, rather than actually based on any form of health evidence. But, I got into a little bit of trouble with it, both on my social media and actually through some of the listeners from this podcast, because people were concerned that I wasn't understanding what health at every size was. And my understanding, having actually spent a significant amount of time looking into it, is that it is sort of a quite significant extension of the body positivity movement. The body positivity movement was probably net positive. It allowed for the idea that not everybody needed to be a supermodel size, that actually there's a range of sizes that could be healthy, and that we shouldn't discriminate people based on their size. All of those things I 100% believe. But I think it's gone a little bit too far to say that there's no such thing as healthy food or unhealthy food, that we shouldn't be telling people that they need to exercise more because, different people have different lifestyles. It's not the fact that people are large, it's the fact that they're discriminated against is the largest issue. But I think all of these ideas actually hide the fact that on average, people who are morbidly obese, very, very large, have an enormous amount of impact on their health outcomes. And a lot of those, and I think the problem is that it's a backlash to the idea that it's all personal responsibility. And I don't believe that the obesity problem is entirely due to personal responsibility. I think a lot of it is environmental, the way that we, have more convenience food available, people are more sedentary, people are more stressed, people are more lonely. All of these things are adding together to create a perfect storm for the obesogenic environment and obesity crisis that we have. And my concern is that if we promote this health at every size idea that, it's not the food that's the problem, people can do whatever they like, we just need to not discriminate against them, it opens the door for policy making to completely ignore any public health advice. It opens their door to say that, we don't need to do anything about tackling the cost of living crisis to make healthy food cheaper, because there's no such thing as healthy or unhealthy food. We don't need to do anything to try and promote active transport or public transport so that people are less sedentary. These are all really important things. And if we ascribe to this set of values that are not evidence-based, health at every size, then we lose ability to actually help people that need help. We actually lose the ability to make people healthier, and we become more reliant on surgery and medications, and people become more chronically unwell. But this idea has captured so many people, so many, I'm going to say this, so many women doctors have been captured by this idea. And if you criticize this idea, if you attack it and say, well, there's no evidence for this, you get labeled with things like, oh, you're classist or you're racist because you're telling people that they should be doing this when actually that's being mean, or you might hurt their feelings. You don't know that they can afford to eat healthy. And I'm like, I don't know if they can afford to eat healthy or not healthy based on, their appearance or based on their ethnicity. I think it's up to them to make those decisions for themselves.
You would think so. I mean, there is a great deal of ideological blindness, and people who adhere very strongly to an ideological view of the world can go around not really seeing things for what they are, because if it clashes with their ideology, it's almost like some sort of religious cult, and they feel, well, my core beliefs are being violated. What do you do when your core beliefs are violated? You lash out. You don't act rationally always. And again, you can see this throughout history. And so these are telltale signs, and the telltale signs partly are how preposterous the suggestions are, but more so the reaction. So if you criticise their views, like if someone criticised my views, I'm just going to say, well, fine, let's talk about it. But if you criticise the ideologically obsessed, their reaction is quite different. You don't even have a right to criticise. And if you do, you get subject to a whole lot of name-calling, and it's an attack on the person rather than the issue. Those are all telltale signs that this is a weak argument, and people are held captive to that ideology. Now, there are probably various psychological reasons why people fall into that situation, but it's certainly not helpful, and you've illustrated that in this particular example. But it applies in all sorts of areas, unfortunately. And
the reason why I say I've looked into health at every size is when I actually Google it, you see that it's actually a concept that's been trademarked by a group called the American Society for Size Diversity or something like that. And you go on their website and there's not a single piece of information about health at every size. There's nothing about, what does it mean to be healthy? How can you improve the health outcomes for these people? It's all about discrimination this, discrimination that. And I'm not saying that there isn't discrimination. Of course there is discrimination, but I don't genuinely believe that is the actual cause for different health outcomes.
It's unfortunate. And I mean, this is really life and death issue. This is how dangerous ideological adherence can be.
Well, it's really quite life and death. I mean, I want to bring it back to what I was talking about earlier about the history of, China, really. So my dad was born, I think my dad must have been born in like the mid-50s or thereabouts, maybe a bit later. And so he lived through, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and the patterns of behaviour that I'm seeing in society right now and how we discuss these topics, they are eerily similar to what's happened in the past as well. And that's why I talk about this authoritarian way of speaking about these topics. So, there was this really idealistic idea that communism was going to solve poverty. But I think what people don't understand is that to get there, you have to have very authoritarian ways of doing things to get there. And with the Great Leap Forward, like people, people who were peasants in the countryside were thought of as, so innocent. They were the people that we should look up to, and we should get rid of intellectuals. Like, this is literally what happened. And these people in the countryside, like, they were rewarded for having, better yield on their crops. But what actually happened was they didn't actually have better yield on their crops. What they did was that while they were told that, the officials were going to come in and inspect, their grain, and when they were about to come in and inspect them, what the peasants would do is that they would just dig up, rice plants, and then just put them in the same area to artificially make it look like they were growing. They were somehow magically able to grow more rice per square meterage. And then it became like a competition. So everyone started doing that. And then so the government was like, oh, wow, this is great. Like, we have somehow managed to double, triple our yield. And so by that calculation, meaning that everyone's able to do it like that, we're going to have created this much grain. And so we're going to be able to feed this many people. But because they obviously missed the mark by so many, many times, it caused probably one of the worst famines in Chinese history, where millions of people died. My own grandfather, my dad's dad, when my dad was 6 years old, died during this famine. So these are the consequences when people feel like they cannot speak out because they feel like something's not quite right. And it happened again, just not very long afterwards, with the Cultural Revolution, where a bunch of university students were, they all got all riled up by the leader of the party at the time to go and attack intellectuals. So, intellectuals, teachers, anybody who was labelled as anti-revolutionary were attacked, and millions of people killed again because of this idea that you couldn't speak out, you couldn't be intellectual. And I'm concerned that there are people who have this very idealistic view of what, communism is, and very idealistic views of no, you just don't understand. These people did, really good things, and we just want to be able to share everything, and you just don't understand our way of being or our ideas. Instead of actually interrogating their own ideas and interrogating why someone might disagree with you, we've fallen into this trap of what I call authoritarian way of thinking.
Yeah, and you can see signs of that everywhere. I mean, it's surprising with the Chinese case because, and with communism generally, if you look at the former Soviet bloc, you'd struggle to find a communist country in the world that's been successful, that's desirable to live in, that people haven't escaped from. And if you look at the Soviet Union or communist China, there weren't millions of people from the West trying to break into those countries to get citizenship. Quite the opposite. People were leaving. And that's how people vote when they're desperate. They leave. And that's an indication of how bad it was. Plus, of course, as you say, the tens of millions of people who were murdered. It's about as horrific as it gets. So to defend that system, you have to pass those impassable hurdles. You have to account for all that misery, all the destruction, all the economic failure, all the social and cultural failure, and say, why is that a good thing? And unless you can do that, then you can't really sort of go ahead and say this is a wonderful thing. But unfortunately, some people do.
Because I feel like the narrative right now, at least in Western media and Western society, is that authoritarianism is a right-wing thing. That's right-wing fascism is authoritarian. But I think that's really naive to think there's only one side of a political spectrum that is capable of authoritarianism.
Yeah, I think so. I think for all political groups and maybe even parties, power is an appetite that grows with the eating. The more you have, the more you want. And there are various ways you can extend your power. It can be through controlling people's incomes, making more benefit categories, things like that, so people are more dependent on the state. All sorts of things, right through to the very draconian measures. And so maybe the issue isn't a left or right one, sort of a fascist or communist one, or gradients of those. Maybe the issue is more or less power in the state. And a lot of economists have argued over centuries, going back even to Adam Smith, that things can take care of themselves, that we don't need the state to be that present in people's lives. The less involvement it has, the better. It has a function for providing public goods, for providing welfare for people who need it, and for defence and all sorts of other functions like that. But in terms of regulating what people think and controlling behaviour, that's a step too far.
Do you think universities are still fit for purpose as a place for open debate, challenging ideas, and, dare I say it, free speech?
They try to be. There are things that have intruded on that recently. One of them is that over the past several decades, students have had to pay a bigger amount of their own money to cover the cost of study. So it's a much more transactional relationship. From a student's point of view, it makes perfect sense. I'm spending tens of thousands of dollars to get my degree. I'm foregoing work for 3 years at least to get it, so I'm losing a lot there. I expect this, this, and this, and I don't want anyone to interfere with that. So I think partly students are more focused purely on their studies and less so on other groups. And there's anecdotal accounts that membership of student organisations, various hobby groups and so on, has declined from what it was, say, 30, 40 years ago. So it's a very different environment. Some groups do it tough. I know pro-life groups have difficulty. Some Jewish groups have difficulty. So there are cases where there's an extreme amount of hostility directed to certain groups, and that's unfortunate. Ideally, there would be tolerance for all sorts of organisations and all points of views, but maybe it's just a reflection of society at large.
I guess my concern from what you were saying is that with the increased costs is it becomes more of a commodification of education. What I've been thinking about is, are we sort of producing a bums on seats model of tertiary education where the idea is to try and get as many students through and get them passed, because that's how you get the most funding, I think, from both the student and the government?
Well, I don't think that comes so much from the universities, funnily enough, but I know in the past there have been political parties that have campaigned on having higher achievement in our education system. It's been around for a while. In fact, there are metrics to measure countries which say, look, X number of percentage of people from this country graduate with a degree, as though that's a good thing. My personal preference would be that the market would decide how many people degrees we need. So if you want to forego 3 years of earning and do a degree, well, presumably there'll be a job that compensates you for that sacrifice. But if there isn't, ultimately the market will say, no, we're saturated with this. So, but
I feel like the market is, instead of saying, oh, we don't need people, they're then saying, oh, you need at least a bachelor's degree for an entry level.
Inflation,
degree inflation. You need a bachelor's degree for an entry level job. And if you want, higher up level job, you actually need a master's when previously you just needed a bachelor's.
Yeah, the advantage of that, though, of course, is it may be that you get people who are perhaps more articulate, who can express themselves better, who can do the work better, have higher capacity for workload. I don't know. But
I guess the concern is that you don't know what the market's going to be like until you're at the end of the degree. And so you start and you've got at least 3 years ahead of you before you graduate, and then know what the market is going to be like. So I guess my concern is that, are we selling people this idea that everybody who goes to university and to studies whatever they want gets a job afterwards? Because I guess the concern is a degree a qualification or an education? And my concern is that it's not really stacking up as a qualification if people aren't actually getting a good job security when they finish university. And also, I guess the concern is, are they getting a quality education as well? Are they actually learning something? Are they learning how to critically think or think about things differently, challenge their own ideas, exercise their brains in a way that's not just rote learning?
The statistics show that people who graduate from New Zealand University with a bachelor's degree have a far higher than average rate of employment, and over the course of their life earn substantially more than those who haven't graduated. So on those two bases alone, it would suggest that getting a degree is preferable to not getting one. Having said that, if your inclination is to do something else, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think it'd be wrong if, and I know there are some, I've come across families who say, well, you must get a degree. because it's attached to social status or whatever else. That's not a good motive. If your inclination is to do something completely different, then presumably you follow that. So there are good reasons to get degrees. There are good reasons not to get them. But they do bring a different sort of degree of diversity, I think, to society over time. If you can imagine what New Zealand society was like in terms of diversity of ideas, say in the 1950s, where far fewer people graduated from university, I think you could argue that it was a far narrower type of society with a narrower range of interests, particularly in things like the arts and music and literature and so on. So maybe that's improved as a consequence too. It's not a material improvement you can instantly measure, but it's an improvement to the quality or diversity of society.
I think that it's important to think about the other benefits of degree. Like I say, it's not just about getting a job. Like I think about how we do medical education in New Zealand, which is that it's just an undergraduate medical program for most people. But I think, wouldn't it have been nice if I was able to do a bachelor's degree in something kind of different, or, do my pre-medical studies, but also do a little bit of philosophy or psychology and learn more about people, because I learn about people in medicine in a way this is the anatomy, this is the physiology, this is how the circulatory system works, this is how the brain works, but at a neuroscience level and a little bit on a mental health level, but not really in a, almost like a spiritual level of like, how do people function in community and how do people derive meaning? And
maybe. But then you consider this. You consider you're doing this podcast in which you're doing exactly that. So maybe that.
But not everyone has this opportunity. Well, I mean,
no.
Okay. People anybody can start a podcast these days, but a lot of people don't.
No, but the thing is your inclination to do it. So although your discipline is in one area, which you've described, the fact that you had to labour so hard in that discipline opened up your mind to the possibility of discovering other things. And I mean, I know the doctors I know have very keen interest in history. Never studied it, but interested in it. And I think their particular discipline kick-started that process of saying, I want to discover more and I'm going to apply myself to it. And it radiates out through life.
What do you think about, I hear stories about the issues of, I don't know if you call it issues, but the extra roadblocks that cultural compliance has within academia. So I'll just put it to an example for me. I've never really done research myself. I've never been what I call like a principal investigator or anything on research. I was trying to do research a few years ago on mental health related presentations to the Children's Emergency Department. And, for a myriad of reasons, I couldn't do it. There was just a lot of paperwork. I didn't know what I was doing. It was going to be like way too big of a project to do by myself. I had no funding. I don't know how to get funding, so I just canned it. But one of the things that I did, one of the things that was difficult for me was that to even apply for ethics, because obviously you have to go into people's personal data, go into people's health record to actually see, was this presentation to the emergency department actually related to a mental health issue? Because we actually don't code people's presentations to the hospital in a way that makes it easy for us to actually track these things. So I'd actually have to go into a person's record and decide, this laceration to the arm, was it because they were harming themselves or, that kind of thing. And to get ethics to be able to do this, because it would obviously include Māori patients, because it included every patient that came through the door for a certain amount of years. There was a requirement to get sign-off from a Māori academic to, get this through to the ethics. And I couldn't figure out how to do it. I was like, oh God, I need it. Unfortunately, there's no Māori doctor where I work, or no Māori senior doctor where I work. And so I was like, oh God, I'll just have to email a bunch of people, I guess, and just see if any of them will reply. And so I don't know, I probably emailed 5 or 6 Māori academics and to no reply. And I get there. I'm like, I'm just some stranger. I'm some random person emailing you to ask if you would help me do this thing for free. And, they're probably busy. I imagine that as an academic, you've got a lot of things going on and, you probably feel stretched. And I think this is a concern that happens for a lot of people who are working in the system who are people of colour or various different demographics who have this sort of unseen extra responsibility just because of, who they are or who they're seen to be part of. You hear about Māori doctors who, are an intensive care doctor or an emergency doctor who are having to be present for every, porphyry or every blessing or, have to get the sign off for every sort of cultural compliance thing going on in their department. And it's extra unpaid work that you're putting on people that they didn't necessarily ask for. I'm sure there are people who are more than happy to do this kind of work, but it adds extra load on people who didn't ask to be having to sign off everything. It also adds extra load on people who are just trying to do the work to actually improve, say, health outcomes or improve research. I saw the research a few years ago, and it was I think it was at the University of Auckland, and it was done by a scientist, and I think she was Asian descent of some sort, and she was doing research on a vaccine for strep pyogenes, which is the bacteria that is responsible for rheumatic fever, which causes an enormous amount of problems in our Pacifica and Māori population. But the problem is that she was her research grant was running out. She couldn't find any research, and I thought, this is such important research. I don't know if it's possible to create like an effective, safe vaccine for this particular bacteria, but this could make an enormous amount of difference in the health outcomes for Māori and Pacifica. And she couldn't get funding for this research, and I just thought, how could this type of research not get funding? And I don't know. I don't have any answers. But I guess what I'm worried about is, are there some hoops that we're trying to get people to jump through that are actually holding, effective research back?
Well, there's a history to this. There are probably two main points to mention in that history. The first one is, for many, many decades, Māori have been sort of excluded from all sorts of research. Partly because the argument has been, well, we're all human beings, therefore we don't need to categorise, but also, and that's a thin argument, but also a more substantial argument that some people have used, they've said, well, our research doesn't relate to this, and so it's not so important. The problem is this, that in a lot of research, particularly in social policy research, Marae were excluded for decades, and so the policy responses didn't fit the groups they were intended for. There was no voice for Marae, no mechanism of expressing, they couldn't say, look, I feel this about something, or this is how my living arrangements would be preferable, whatever else. That wasn't included. So as a reaction to that, there's been efforts to accommodate that by saying, well, look, we need some sort of Marae input into this research. The other one is a constitutional one. If the state's providing funding, then if Marae party to the treaty with the Crown, then presumably there has to be some input in that as well. So those are two good reasons for that Marae input into research funding. The problem is when it starts to have no discernible benefit, but it has adverse consequences, as in the example you've described. Discernible benefit needs some measurement and doesn't have to be purely say, well, look, this will benefit this group. It might just be the expression of a cultural value is in itself a benefit. That can be useful. But when it crosses the boundary to actually being counterproductive to the group itself, so if Marae are adversely affected by the fact of having to give consent to some research and there isn't the person available to give that consent, that would suggest that the process doesn't work for anyone's benefit. And then you'd have to question, why do we have it? But you have to jump over the hurdle of, well, that's a constitutional requirement. So what's required really here is some common sense and some balance. And that's common sense, again, is tricky to find at sometimes.
So a colleague of mine, they were concerned about privacy issues for individual patients to do with, how we actually structured the environment at work. And they thought, okay, well, let's just put like a screen, like one of those like sort of what do they call, it's a so you couldn't see through it, like a frosted tint kind of thing on a glass door, because you could see straight in. And sometimes patients were having quite invasive procedures or procedures that were very very invasive in terms of like your privacy, right? And thought, oh, we really need to do something about privacy to protect these patients from random people who were just walking past. And you'd think common sense, like, oh, okay, just we'd put in the order, someone will come along and, frost this glass door. It makes sense. But for some reason, there needed to be some sort of cultural compliance check. They needed to get the sign off from some cultural competence compliance people to actually allow for a door to have a frosted screen on it. And it took months. You know, people were busy, people had other things to do, and it took a lot of pushing to get a glass door, you know, frosted screen done.
Yeah, that's frustrating. I mean, part of it you can attribute to a procedural problem or a bureaucratic or administrative problem. If it's going to take that long, then maybe it's a systems issue rather than the basis of compliance itself. If it is a compliance thing, one way of looking at it, and it's slightly reframing it, is if you've had experiences over 3 or 4 generations, say of a health system that hasn't been particularly friendly to you, that's blamed you for everything that's wrong with you, blamed you personally, that's been derogatory and racist to you. And if you get a chance to monitor what happens in that health system, I suspect you'd want to monitor every single thing just to make sure that little crack of racism doesn't open up anymore. And it might seem overly bureaucratic and require a lot of compliance, but it's a protective measure to make sure that something bad doesn't happen in the future. So if we can prevent that racism from recurring, that's got to be a good thing. But the process obviously is something a bit separate, and if they can make it more efficient, you would think they would.
Earlier this year, I went to a conference, the New Zealand Women of Medicine conference, and I went to this talk, and I thought it was fascinating. It was a talk by, I think they're called Toa architects. So they do a lot of architecture with tikanga Māori involved, and they were talking about introducing. Really you're right, yeah, you know about them. They talked about how do we introduce tikanga into the architecture of how we design our hospitals, and it was quite confronting to see how our hospitals are really not person-centered, because my interpretation from what I've learned about, you know, tikanga so far, just like basic tikanga that, you know, we have, which is don't sit on tables where you're going to eat, you know, the head is sacred, you know, all these things, like, you know, it's not a foreign concept that people need to be afraid of. It's like pretty straightforward human-centered stuff. They talked about how in some hospitals, to get to the morgue and back, people have to walk past or walk through a cafeteria to get to the morgue. Like that's just not nice, like in general. Like it doesn't, like, you know, tikanga in that way, like makes sense. Like, you know, the morgue should be very separate from where people go to eat, you know, these little things. You know, I think tikanga could provide like a lot of better patient-centered care, like in general. Like I don't think it's something to be afraid of. No,
and I think that's, again, how it comes back to an issue of framing. So many people see this as a binary. You know, you have your views, cultural views, I have mine, and any expansion of yours comes at the cost of mine. So it's
not a zero-sum game.
Right. So if you approach it from the principle of mutual benefit, that the expansion of your cultural views benefits me, I'm quite happy for that to happen, then everything takes on a different complexion, and all of a sudden you find out, well, instead of resisting everything all the time and digging your heels and saying, no, that violates me or that threatens me in some way, so actually I benefit from this. And when you have that principle of mutual benefit at play, people have a different attitude towards cultural engagement. They're actually keen to find out more because, you know, the more I find out about that culture, the more I personally benefit from it. And so it's really how you frame it, I think, that can affect these things. The problem is when you get two groups that have different frames of reference working together, that can be a bit combustible.
A very dear friend of mine, Carlton Irving, who I had on this podcast a few years ago, very early on, he's just graduated medical school. He was a critical care paramedic before. He's very passionate about Māori healthcare and rural healthcare, and he helped actually create sort of like a te reo language and tikanga Māori program down in University of Otago, because he's like, oh gosh, we don't have any real strong cultural safety program here. And so he started this, and he was saying, what he said was, you know, we can make more Māori doctors, that's fine, but we can make more doctors Māori in the sense that we can actually provide a program that actually invites people who aren't part of, you know, who aren't Māori themselves, be part of the culture and understand what it's like to be on the Marae, and, you know, what our culture is, basically, to understand more. And I think that's beautiful.
I'd be very worried if someone said, I want to understand less. But this happens. Well, no, because this is what happens when people say, I'm closing myself off to that culture. They're saying, I actually want to know less. And I wonder what's going through their minds, because I would have thought that any opportunity to learn is a good opportunity. And You might not like it, or you might like it, or it might intrigue you, or might repulse you, doesn't matter, but you learn about something, and that's important. And so when people hear the word cultural training and all the defences go up, I wonder, what are you left with then? If you're going to close off any opportunity of embracing or discovering about a new culture, what are you left with? And you're just left with that core of what you already have, and that's a bit limiting, I would have thought.
Bit sad.
Yeah.
What do you think about what's been happening with the history curriculum for high school, or school in general, right? My understanding is that there was a new national curriculum on history that I think they started working on it in 2022, was my understanding, and then sort of rolling out in the last couple of years. What are your thoughts on how that's been going on, how the process has been going in developing this curriculum?
I think in private conversations I've had with historians from just about every university in the country, it's not been a wonderful curriculum for all sorts of reasons. Well, I could start the other end. The many emails I get from teachers and from parents now in the last year or so saying that, Johnny was looking forward to studying history at high school, and the way that the curriculum has been designed, he's been put off the subject. Now, if this was one or two people, okay, but it seems to be from across the country. And I get teachers who also complain that it's killing interest in the subject. So I think just in terms of the design of it and the way topic selection has been done, it's pretty poor.
How so?
Okay, so it talks about these, what they call big ideas, the big ideas that we want students to focus on. So already it's prescriptive. It's saying you must believe that this is a big idea. You must believe that Marae history, for example, is central to all New Zealand history.
Is it not?
Well, it depends on what Marae history is. History isn't limited to one group. So, for example, Pākehā history doesn't exist in New Zealand because it's, in and of itself, because it's connected with Marae history. It's all interconnected. And the idea that you can sort of somehow separate these out into standalone, isolated compartments, and then say, "Oh, this fits here and this fits here." That's not how history works. No one goes through life existing as an island. We're all connected to everyone else. So by creating this idea that there's a specific Maori history, and by the way, they use the term plural. They call it histories, as though there are different histories in New Zealand. And that sounds a bit innocuous. It sounds a bit silly, but it sounds a bit innocuous. But really what they're saying is that different ethnic groups have their own histories, and it's not as simple as that, because so much of one group's history is tied in with its relations with the other. You can't disentangle that. It's necessarily connected. So by making them into discrete histories, it's intellectually, I think, quite impoverished. Then there's the emphasis on power, which people who are interested in Marxism will pick up straight away, that so much of history is seen as a relationship of power, one group trying to dominate another and so on.
But is it not relevant, though?
Well, I mean, there's so much literature now which debunks that idea that history is to be seen as a dynamic of power, because there's so much else that's happening as well. So much we do in our day-to-day life is not about us going, well, look, how do I assert more power over this situation, or how do I dominate this? And that's not how we actually operate.
But I wonder if there's a consequence of not acknowledging power imbalances. Like we talk about it in healthcare, like there's a power imbalance in terms of knowledge between, a healthcare professional and a patient.
There's always going to be power imbalances, but they're not. And that's inevitable. So firstly, we can't say that's something that's bad or good. It's just the nature of things. It's like gravity. You can disagree with it, but it's there. It's not going to change. So yes, there are power imbalances. The question is, do they fall along certain lines, ethnic lines, cultural lines, age lines, gender lines, and so on? They sort of seem to, but they sort of don't. And there's too many exceptions to say that they absolutely do. So there's problems with that. But why would you introduce this into a school curriculum? Then there's the things that aren't emphasised. So this becomes a central thing. They're the big ideas, but I would have thought big ideas would have included things like economic history or cultural history, feminist history, gender history, foreign affairs history, migrant history, refugee history, all these sorts of things. These are all big ideas too, but they sort of float around on the periphery. So what that does, and it has a marginalisation effect. If you don't belong to a certain group, and you're not part of the big idea that they talk about, then you're a sort of peripheral idea. And so one of the effects, inadvertently, I suspect, of the curriculum is that it sort of alienates people. They don't feel it's part of my curriculum. There are other problems too. I think the whole thing basically was was poorly designed by people who aren't especially competent, and the Royal Society was commissioned to do a review on it. A number of historians were involved in that, and the Royal Society concluded that there were some shortcomings in the curriculum. I don't think they've been necessarily addressed.
Do you think it's a bit isolationist?
Oh, very much so. And it comes from a particular political ideological orientation, and that's blatantly obvious. Now, if I support that orientation 100%, I still wouldn't want it, because that's not what history is. History isn't about propaganda. It's not about using history to right the wrongs. This is a phrase that some teachers have used. You can draw on history to right a wrong if you see it wrong, but that's not the function of history. The function of history is to understand what happened, to make sense of it, to learn from it, to see how it fits in with the present day, to see how there's sort of a lineage of what happens now connected to what happened before, and so on. But the idea that we're going to use this history for political ends, to pressure groups, whatever else, that's something a bit separate. And this is very much where the curriculum tilts to. One of the problems, of course, is that it becomes politicised. It's been made political in the way it's been designed. And so now we have a different government. They're going to re-politicise it, I suspect, in another way. And so it doesn't necessarily resolve the problem. So rather than sort of playing this game of, whose ideology triumphs, I would have thought a good way of doing it is actually going back to the students, being serious about what works for them, what interests you about history. And one of the things that doesn't work is names and dates of kings and queens. That's, if you want to kill the subject, focus on that. But the other thing, of course, is, and I think some people think students are thick. They're not. They very quickly realise when they're being preached to. I know this because I've had students tell me, whole classes tell me, in fact, they resent parts of the curriculum because they're being told they must think in a certain way. Well, that's anti-intellectual, and you've got to wonder what sort of curriculum allows that to exist.
Can you give me some examples of, what's in the curriculum, like explicitly?
Okay, I'll give you one example from a teacher who contacted me. So the veracity of this is the veracity of the teacher's email. He said that they went to a regional conference where a number of history teachers from that area attended, and they were told one of the topics that they should teach about is the so-called doctrine of discovery, which is a Catholic doctrine from the end of the 15th century that said that Christian countries are to go to non-Christian countries, effectively forcibly convert the occupants, take the land, claim the land in the name of Europe and so on. And that's how New Zealand was colonised, through its doctrine of discovery. This is what they're told. Now, in fact, more than one teacher contacted me about this, and one headmaster as well, because it's just not true. Firstly, that doctrine was overturned within a few years. Secondly, it had nothing to do with British colonisation at all. Britain had rejected the Catholic Church centuries before it got involved in New Zealand. And rather than try to subjugate people and actively try to claim land, as we know from all the evidence, Britain was very hesitant about getting involved in New Zealand and was quite happy to let Marae govern themselves, at least in 1840. So, I mean, it's one of those areas of history where there's no debate. The doctrine of discovery absolutely did not apply to New Zealand, and there's probably half a dozen reasons you can prove why it didn't. But the teacher's being told you have to teach this. And one teacher who complained said that his own headmaster afterwards found out about the fact that he had challenged this at this meeting, and he had to face some consequences for that. So when you're getting to the point of teaching something that's false, the alarm bells really ought to start ringing at that point.
Do we know about how, the processes of how they came up with this curriculum?
It'll be interesting. One of the things that I think, again, is a cause of concern is the fact that there's so much clandestine about the whole thing. So the people involved for a while were anonymous. We've since found out perhaps they're not the most ideal people to have put the curriculum together, if I can put it that way. I think they certainly lacked a lot of knowledge about particular elements of history. So there's a whole branch of history, for example, that deals with causality. And it's a very intricate branch about what's the nature of causality, how you can and can't attribute causality to actions, and so on, the degree to which you can, the infinite regression of causality. It goes on and on. And people who've studied historical method will know about this. Now, there are causal arguments in the curriculum that shouldn't be there. They're basic errors. So it suggests that the
For
people...
example?
Well, they're saying that X causes Y, or this leads to that. And there's a correlation sometimes, but the nature of the causality isn't that clear. So, for example, what constitutes a cause is they talk about cause and consequences in the curriculum all the time. So you link this with this, and you see patterns of causes all the way through. But causality doesn't actually work like that in a lot of cases. It's something you see in hindsight as a pattern, but you don't see at the time. Test it on your own life. If you look back to where you were, say, 10 years ago, okay, and you can say, well, this happened that caused that, this happened that caused that, this happened. You can see that. And you look back on your life now and you write a story about your life in the last 10 years and you see all the causal properties all the way through. Very simple to see. But you couldn't have done that when you lived through it. You couldn't have known, if I do this, this will happen. So it looks causative in hindsight, but it's not in practice. And so what they've done, they've applied the hindsight. They've read history backwards and said, well, this caused this, caused this, caused this. And it looks like it did, just like it does with your life. You look back at all the causes that led to where you are now. But at the time, they're not causative because you can't identify the cause to act on it. It just, in hindsight, it looks causative. So that's one dimension of causation.
Do you mean it's the whole hindsight has 20/20 vision? Is that what you're meaning?
But also it goes further. You see causal patterns in hindsight that you don't see at the time. If you did, life would be very different because you can predict what you're going to do 10 years from now. You can predict because you can say these are the causes that will lead to it. Well, you can't. You can only see it in hindsight. So that's just one branch of causality that they've got wrong. But they just haven't really thought about it. And I don't think the people involved were equipped intellectually to do that.
The concern that I have about, I guess, ideologically led education and history as well. So when I was about 10 years old, my parents brought me to China for about 3 months so that my brother and I could have some more Chinese immersion, work on our Chinese. They put us in school for a bit, my brother in essentially kindergarten and me in, year 2 because my Chinese was not very good. And also, turns out maths in New Zealand was not at the same level as they taught it in China. So I went to school and I tried to learn Chinese and, all these books that I had to read. And thankfully they had the English phonetics, so I could at least kind of read it along, kind of. And I remember my dad got very upset. So I came back with this book and we were reading it and I kind of didn't really think too much of it. I was 10 years old. And it was this story about this young boy, probably 10 years old. This is probably set in, 30s or 40s, when there was Japanese imperialism in China. And the story is about this young peasant boy villager who was out and about in the fields, and then he stumbles upon these 2 Japanese soldiers, and the soldiers go to this boy and say, "Where's your village? Take us to your village." And this boy, this 10-year-old boy, is like, "Oh no, these are the baddies." And so he realizes he can't take them to the village. They're going to try and take our people or hurt my people. So he takes them somewhere else and lies to them about where the village is. And the Japanese soldiers find out and they kill him. And this is a story that was put in a children's book I was 10, so these kids were 8. These books for 8-year-old kids. And the moral of the story is sacrifice yourself for your nation. And so when you have things like that, you do worry about what kind of stories a state is feeding to their own children.
And tied in with that is the issue of morality in history as well. And I think as the tide has sort of receded on conventional religion in the West, it's left a vacuum. And that vacuum's been filled by other forms of morality. So it's not as though religion has gone. It's been displaced by other ways of thinking about morality. And there are real problems about how we judge the past now. So some historians felt several generations ago that we're reaching the point where we wouldn't be influenced so much by the culture around us and so on. We'd get a purer, this is particularly in the 19th century actually, almost a science version of history that was clean of any sort of distractions. That's never going to happen, and people realise that. But the problem now is that we're getting very clear moral judgments about events. And that's difficult because whose morality do we apply, and why do we even apply morality? So, if you kill 1,000 people, is that a bad thing? We'd say it is. But the person doing it didn't think so. So we're being selective already about the morality that we apply. That's an extreme example. But when it comes to...
Well, I guess the morality is about why did the person, say, kill 1,000 people? Was it to defend their
Well, let's
people?
say it's just a war of aggression. Is that bad? And most people would say yes. But should we really focus on that? And this sounds like a sort of an obscure area to deal with, but there are moral judgments that are intruding into history in unusual ways. So people are being told you must judge this to be bad or this to be good. And the terms of reference to that morality is not clear. And sometimes it seems to be ideological, that one group is deemed to be correct in this battle, the other group was incorrect. But these were the people who were right, these were people who were wrong. And one of the problems there is that students, in addition to understanding what happened and why in the past, are now being required to understand or to make a determination on who was right, who was wrong.
But if you don't do that, how do you learn from it to know what to do next?
Well, we should never get our morality from history because it changes all the time. We can look at things that are acceptable in public now that would have been horrifying to people 100 years ago, and vice versa. I mean, I'm sure we'd be horrified now about public executions. They took place in Queen Street in the 1840s. People would go and watch. No one would want that now, I'm sure. So morality shifts all the time. But when you say to students, you or at least your ancestors are culpable for X, Y, Z, they did something so-called bad, we judge it as bad, you must feel that way, that puts students off. And
I think it doesn't invite people to come along on the journey to actually improve those outcomes that are obviously objectively there.
Yeah. And colonisation is the big one. Colonisation wasn't controlled by a single person. It wasn't controlled by direct policy. The policy was scrambled. I mean, it was really chaotic, say, in the 1830s in Britain. There was no clear colonial policy. So to claim that it was bad really misattributes a whole lot of things to do with the nature of that practice of colonisation. So was colonisation good or bad? Well, the answer is it's if you see it like operating like an ecosystem, is an ecosystem good or bad? So if a lion jumps on an antelope and kills it, is that good or bad? Well, it's good for the lion, it's bad for the antelope. But there's no greater morality apart from that.
Well, arguably, sometimes it is good for the antelope because it weeds out the slower ones and improves their
possibly, although when you're being eaten alive by a lion, maybe not. But this is the point. So if we're in an ecosystem, which is what British colonisation was, there are things we can look on and say, well, that's terrible. We have an instinctive reaction. These people are killed. That's bad. I think we all agree on that. But the process of colonisation is beyond a simple moral calculus, and that's the challenge. And so what's happening is these complex processes with complex issues, philosophical issues about morality, complex political processes being boiled down to a very binary good, bad, that misunderstands colonisation rather than helps us comprehend it. And so these are some of the problems that pop up.
But then how do you, with the colonisation, I find it like challenging because there's a part of me that says, like, it doesn't feel right to go and take something that's kind of not yours, and I guess that's kind of the framing of colonisation is people going to take things. Well, that certainly happened in this country.
If you look at the 1860s, the Crown did exactly that. You get Kingetanga refusing to sell land. The Crown simply says, we will take that land by force. At the point of a gun, we will kill you and take your land. And I think for most people, that's objectively wrong. If there is such a thing as objective morality, that would be immoral, no question. If people go to settle in another country and land's sold to them, and they rip the indigenous people off when they pay for the land, that's immoral as well. But then there's gradients in between. And these clear-cut examples keep getting thrown to the forefront and say, well, look, this is the bad part of colonisation, and absolutely it was. But what constitutes bad and good? So, for example, if someone comes in and says, look, we're going to introduce literacy, so you won't need to remember your oral histories, your whakapapa anymore, because you can write them down. We'll have whakapapa books. Is that good or bad? Well, arguably, it destroys centuries of an oral tradition or elements of that oral tradition, which it did. By the end of the 19th century, there were very few people left who could recite all these very intricate whakapapa, whereas 60, 70 years earlier, it was much more common. Whakapapa books displaced the need to memorise thousands of names in some cases and their connections with each other. Is that a bad thing or a good thing? Well, it destroyed one part of the culture, but it preserved other parts of it. So these things are not as clear-cut as they're presented. And again, when you present it in a binary good, bad, format, it oversimplifies it to the point of meaninglessness, and it deters people because people are sensible enough to know, well, life's not that simple.
All right, so I think we just have enough time for one last question. We've been talking for quite some time now. What is your favourite dinosaur?
Oh, gosh, I don't have one, actually. I've never really thought about dinosaurs.
Well, now you have to think.
I don't know. Brontosaurus is the only one that comes to mind.
Do you not have sons?
Sorry?
Do you not have sons?
Yeah, but I
So not think, like, oh, this dinosaur. Like, I like this Stegosaurus.
probably,
I
I
like
think
the
I ignored
Triceratops.
them when they talked about that sort of thing.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
Revolving Door Syndrome acknowledges Māori as tangata whenua and Te Tiriti o Waitangi partners in Aotearoa New Zealand. We recognise the inequities and challenges faced by Indigenous and vulnerable groups and acknowledge our duty to work towards closing the gap.